Please join me in welcoming Ali Banasadr.
Thank you. Okay. So I don't know how to do timer on my watch, so I'm gonna pretend I'm running for 30 minutes. All right, ready, go. So I wanted to start with this small painting I did in 2006 because the painting is pretty important to me because it was the first time that I was able to make a painting that was strictly based on memory and sound. Usually, before this, when I wanted to paint something, maybe it would have been more literal, like I had to find reference for it to see what that thing looked like. But I think when I did this painting, I thought about how does it look like in my own imagination, as opposed to what does it look like based on references that somebody else has photographed or made or whatever. But also it sort of brought me back to my childhood living in Iran. I grew up in Iran when I was 3, the revolution happened, and then the 8 Years' War with Iraq was going on. So I was living through that and experienced mostly the experience was through sound, because you would hear sounds of bombing, sounds of explosions, air raids, alarms, and you would feel vibrations. And I guess for me as a child, the way to deal with this was to make drawings, just to kind of be able to understand what's happening around me. But it wasn't always just sound, because obviously sometimes you would see visual effects of aftermaths too. And for example, there was a case where a bomb was dropped in the playground of my school, and it had left this giant crater. And I didn't know this had an impact on me, but it must have stayed in my memory in such a way that I was making paintings such as this one that had craters within the landscape. So when I made this painting, I kind of realized that how powerful your memory is, and how that it just became so interesting to know how things look, and things that you kind of internalize. How do these things sort of stay in your imagination, and then what happens to them over time? They're always evolving, they're always changing, they're always in motion. And how do you, as a painter, how do you capture these ungraspable things that are constantly moving and changing in your imagination? Yeah, so again, this painting is from 2007. Again, it's very similar to the first painting, but almost on the opposite side, because the first painting, thinking about, okay, I lived in Iran, the government's propaganda was everything is America's fault. So it's you have the great Satan. And then coming to the US, and then later on, Iran being called axis of evil. And so it's the same propaganda, so you kind of are able to see that very clearly, be able to kind of see through that, and always be able to see things from both sides, or multiple sides, and not really have to feel like you have to settle for one, because that's just one voice. But then, making this painting, later I realized that it was based on, living in New York and witnessing 9/11 from my kitchen window, seeing the whole thing. And it was internalized, and then 6 years later, I made a painting about it without, strategizing. It just sort of happened. And that's, most of my paintings, that's kind of how they kind of come about anyway. This one is called Fool's Errand. And I started to sort of like make these paintings that they had like a bird's eye view, looking at things from a macro level. And I mean, it's hard to see, but there's like tons of like little figures in the painting, even like really, really far back. There's like, like oil drills and things happening back there. So I felt like this sort of bird's eye view kind of was useful, because then you're sort of like pulling out and looking at from a bird's eye view, and you're sort of being you could be a judge of the situation. You're putting the viewer in a place of a judge, where they could just look at the whole situation and make a decision about what they're seeing, as opposed to zooming in on a part and, like showing them a particular problem. I think this is the first painting I made that, like, it made me realize that like stage and theater is like pretty important for me. I always like the idea that, like, things that you see that are happening, like, are these costume figures that are acting, or are they really dressed to represent what you think they represent? So, like, the whole mix of fact and fiction is interesting to me. This one's called The Land of Black Gold. Obviously, this is somewhere from my part of the world, with the patterns and the colors. And yeah, again, like, theme of oil reoccurs in my paintings. I have some other works later on that kind of talks about it, but then kind of thinking about oil being an asset and also being a curse, maybe. And in these paintings, I was kind of bringing in like geometric elements into the work. The colors are kind of off, but there's some like details. This painting is called Prisoners of the Sun TV, and I wanted to make a painting about TV test patterns, because that was always, like, TV test patterns, I mean, they don't come on anymore, I don't think. There's too many things to show on TV nowadays, but it had, like, for me, it has like when I look at it, it has like, I get anxious, because this is the test patterns is the thing that would come on when there was air raids. So, like, you would turn on the TV to hear the siren, and that would let you know that there's air raids happening, and that obviously makes me feel anxious. But I wanted to I was thinking of, like, how do I kind of bring that into my painting, that the test pattern, where you have like you're staring into the test pattern, but then, like, behind it or beyond it, there's like all this conflict and things that are happening. So, like, kind of mixing the images that you have taken in with the test patterns in the background. So here's some details, like this is like very far back where you could see that there's like, where's that laser? Is this a laser? Oh yeah. Like there's all these like small, tiny figures everywhere. This one is called Charlatans. So when I zoom in, you could see that, like maybe like world's leader meeting, or again, like maybe it's like these sort of characters from different time meeting each other. Maybe it's like Shakespeare and I don't know, someone else meeting, like group of them meeting, but also like they all look like they're wearing costumes from like different cultures. And then you have like, maybe you have these like leaders in an ivory tower up there looking down on everyone and making decisions. This one is called Fishing for Souls. It was directly inspired by a painting by Adrian van der Vern in Rijksmuseum. It was a painting about Catholics on one side, Protestants on the other side, and they're fishing for, they're kind of fighting over these bodies in the water, and they're all trying to get them on their side, and I thought maybe I could make like a contemporary version of that, Fishing for Souls, but this time like there's no real distinguished groups where you know who's who anymore. So I like to refer to like, I always say that like my work is a combination of like historical things and present things and then futuristic things, because these are the things you're always thinking about, and it's just a matter of like how do you combine these together. So like going back and thinking about something historical and then kind of making it like for our time again, to just kind of like think about within this 500 years of time, have we changed? Has there been progress? This one is called The Gatekeepers. It's from 2009. I started to do these paintings that had like these dominant, intense color, like sort of color field paintings. But again, there's tons of figures at the bottom, which usually in my paintings they end up, all the heaviness of the painting ends up being at the bottom, where all the like the hybrid human, animal, machine, gods, whatever dwell. And then as you go towards the top of the paintings, usually when it starts to open up and becomes more like ether, or there's like some kind of, this is like the close-up of the figures at the bottom. And then once you go to the top, maybe there's some kind of a transformation and things are changing form into another element per se. This one is called The Magians. Some kind of celebration, some kind of a ceremonial thing is going on. And always with my work, like I work on them. I think about them how they're viewed from far away and how they're viewed like very close up. So I have like two different modes of painting, where one is like very gestural and all overness, and you're like sort of using your body to create the work, and then or the body movement, and then you have then I have like a miniature mode of working, where you're kind of just developing, zooming in on the figures and trying to like bring them out. Get close up. And I like the idea of, discovery, where you have to really look to kind of find something, because like I always like them to be in like motion, but when your eyes could move around and adjust on one location, then maybe you'll see a fragment or part of something, and then that might inform you about what maybe the painting's about, and then maybe you'll start finding other stuff that kind of relate to it. Again, like, you know, you want to slow down time. This one is called Interrogation. And also a little bit about my process, like the way these paintings begin, they're always very abstract at the beginning. And then there's a dialogue that needs to begin with the work that sort of kind of takes it further and further. You have to like open up to the painting and see where it wants to go. And then later on, within the fragmentations that I've created, I start, like my vision starts to kind of connect dots of these fragmentations and kind of see living things within them. And then it becomes a matter of if I want, do I want to bring these figures out or do I want to reject it? So there's a lot of rejecting and developing that's going on, but then the figures always come later. Not like there's never any sketches or anything, so like I never know what's going to happen. I just kind of go into it, and then things kind of come about, and you sort of then edit a lot. This is a very different kind of painting. I called it etching painting because it's actually all the way the figures have come out of this is just by using an etching needle on a masonite. So I like etching, but I don't want to make etching. I don't want to do it on metal. So I just created my own way of doing it. So yeah, I've only made 2 of these. So this is the first one. That's called Black Water. This is called Annunciation. This is like a very small painting. And I started to notice that I want to make these small paintings to be able to kind of zoom in on like just 1 or 2 figures, which kind of made me realize that maybe I want to kind of like start developing figures more, and like you'll see later, like they'll start getting larger and larger in the paintings. This is a bad example because they're all very small. So this, you know, this again going back to like how you're sort of influenced by your surrounding. Like I went to Ecuador and I went in this church, and the whole church is gold. Like it's so powerful, but like your eyes hurt after a while because everything is gold. So like, you know, I think a year or 2 later, I kind of made this painting based on that experience. So travel is good. This is called History. This guy is like struggling with something. It's like always about, you know, history. We're always trying to negotiate with history. We're trying to go back and kind of fill in what was missing and so on. And it looks like an old painting too. This is called The Myth Makers. Again, it's like a small painting where you have these close-up of images. Okay, so I've ran 18 minutes now and lost a lot of calories. This one's called We Haven't Landed on Earth Yet. And, you know, obviously living in our time and being consumed by the digital world, I think, you know, it's inevitable that you're gonna like question these things. So like I think this is the first painting that actually like machine-like elements started to work into my painting. So it was like bringing another element into it, making these hybrids not only earthy but also like robotic. Again, like that metal machine element worked in. This one is called Hypocrisy of Democracy. I think that's from Chris Rock. Small painting, It Was Written, it's called. This is called It's in the Air. So, going back to the process, like the way I make the paintings, I actually hear sounds from the paintings itself. It's something that like has been with me since I was making those drawings when I was a child, and hearing those sounds around me. But then later on I realized that there's sort of like a parallel world of hearing sounds and they transform into visual, and then looking at visual things and have them transform into sound. I mean, synesthesia is the name for it. I didn't know that for a long time. I thought everybody had that. But so in order for me to be able to compose the work and have it have this like sort of musical harmony and air running through the paintings, it's always like this, you know, as soon as I put the brush down, there's a sound, and then I'm able to understand this is where I stop, this is where I like put dots, this is where I kind of begin again, and you know, you know, color, shape, texture, all these things have different notes of sounds. It's never like, you know, it's not like I listen to music and I make soundtrack paintings. It's like the sound that actually comes from the painting itself while I'm working on it. This is called The Devil. It's a small one too. This is a triptych called Farveshi, which it's a symbol of like fire and light. It was commissioned for a show in Venice Biennial that had to do with Azerbaijan and all the surrounding countries. And you know, I've thought Zoroastrian religion is something that they all sort of have in common. So it was I wanted to sort of use a painting that kind of had those symbols in it. Contact, this is the painting, one of the paintings that's here. Yeah, I felt a lot of tension. I felt like there was a lot of tension in this painting when I was making it. But something happened in this painting where like the paintings sort of became more airy and the figures became larger. And it sort of like kind of opened up a new way of painting, I guess. And in 2014, I did this painting called Motherboard, where I was literally trying to think how do I create a digital zone? You know, you have the landscape, but then how do I bring that fourth zone? You know, you have the middle ground, foreground, middle ground, background, but then how do I bring in like a fourth zone into this, where to me, like I wanted to kind of paint the sound of internet, especially like the, you know, like the AOL dial-up kind of sound. And like the dragging of the paint sort of did that for me. So I made a bunch of paintings that sort of had this sort of like fourth zone within them. This is a triptych right after that one. That actually, funny thing, when I was making this painting, I had an accident with my right hand and it got cut, and I painted this with my left hand. So it's kind of funny, like the composition is something I wouldn't do, but usually. This one is called Incubator, 2014. Civilization. I made these paintings that, like, I was thinking about the fight between visual and language, and I wanted to, like, create these sort of, I mean, they kind of like could be writings, but we don't know what it really says, but it's just like a it's like a symbol of writing, maybe, and sort of like the relationship between language and art and the fight between them. This one's called The Lesser Lights. Yeah, I don't know where these figures come from, really. I mean, they're and they sometimes show up in other paintings. They're sort of like actors that, you know, like show up in another painting with a different costume, perhaps. This is like the largest painting I've done. It's 60 by 288 inches. And again, I wanted to sort of like kind of concentrate only on the figures. So it's kind of like a frieze. Okay, I have 4 more minutes to run. This is called Broken Land. Again, I was like thinking about metal. I had this studio in Bushwick in Brooklyn, and there was a alleyway there, and across from it there was this like old metal factory that had dumped metal on the ground for like 40 years. And it was just the most surreal space because you had all this rustic metal, and then you had plants growing out of them all over. And I was just kind of taken by it, and I thought that's just like a perfect metaphor of like mixing the metal rust and like nature, really. This is a small painting called Bandit. Again, like my interest in etching, just using a monochromatic color kind of gives me the ability to be kind of like work like if it's an etching. This one is called Age. Sunrise. This one is called En Medias Res, which is Latin for when a story begins from like a midpoint of the story. And I thought that kind of made sense with my work because they're always sort of explosive and middle of the action, and then later on you kind of like your eye starts to go after the worlds within worlds, and the stories of each figure might take you to another direction. It's called Foreign Lands. Somebody, a friend, like an artist friend of mine, actually Inka Essenheim, who had a show here. I had a studio visit, and she was like, I don't know these places you paint. Like, they're so foreign. They're like not of this world. And I kind of stole that title from her. It's fitting. And I also think about like I think about the canvases as like sort of like a place where, like a time machine, where you could have historical things meeting futuristic things, meeting things that are happening in our current time, and somehow like try to make sense of all these different things, all these different times. This is called Myth. And I was thinking about, like, we as human beings, we've always liked to tell ourselves stories. And these stories, they're like imagined stories. And we kind of live by these stories. But sometimes when these stories become debunked, then everything that was believed kind of vanishes. And I kind of find that interesting, that happens all the time. This one is also in this show. It's called Treasure. And as I said, like, I always see my work as personal history, combination of personal history, art history, and history of our time. And this painting happens to be one that leans more towards like the historical and the personal, because this is like after I had my first child, and I was looking at the Adoration of the Magi paintings a lot, because they all have to do with baby being born. And I started to notice that, like, we had so many visits in our house, and I started to notice that, like, there was this gravity of everyone kind of like leaning over, looking at the baby in the crib, It's just like, I kept seeing that in my house, and I kind of connected it to these historical paintings that, like, you see the same thing happening. So, yeah, so there's the... All right, I think I'm going over, but... So this painting is called Oil. So I imagine oil as like this monster that's coming out of the ground to like swallow everybody. But then also oil, like this guy's painting over there. I don't know if you see this guy. He has his palette. So it's, like as a painter, you're always thinking about multiple things, but then like also like metaphor of painting too. This is called Curtain Call. This is called The Rise of the Blonde. It doesn't have an E at the end. It's just blonde. It's during election. This guy. This is called Mosaic People. And I was thinking about... I was looking at like Islamic, like mosaics, and then also thinking how digital they look. And I kind of decorated some of these figures with those Islamic patterns that also could be like a pixel. There's actually like this graffiti writer who does like, you've seen it, like he does pixels everywhere. Maybe he hasn't come here. This is called Trust in the Future. I'll hurry up through the rest. We Work in Shadows. These are like fairly recent paintings. This is from 2017. Sort of thinking about the underworld, or had Dante's Inferno in mind, but also thinking that those places in Dante's Inferno could be our levels of our own subconscious. The Game of Taming. These are 2018, so I'm having a show in Berlin actually later this month, so these are all for this. These are fairly new. And whenever works are very new, they're harder to talk about. But this is supposed to be me here. So it's it's sort of like, it's a pelican or some kind of a bird, but he's a painter also. So I was thinking about, birds being a descendant of dinosaurs, and thinking about, as a painter, you kind of feel like a dinosaur sometimes, because it's such an old, tradition, but you're trying to speak about contemporary things. This is called Language of the Birds, which is loosely influenced by the story of Conference of the Birds. It's like a 12th century Persian writer. The Building of Icarus. I was thinking maybe Icarus is going to have another go at it in our time. You know, maybe he'll make it. Probably not. This is called Riding on the Storm. They were talking about, you know, storm of information, you know, being overwhelmed by storm of information, and maybe this has something to do with that. This is the second etching painting that I've done called The Wretched of the Earth. And it's the last painting called The World Upside Down. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you all. This has been really engaging and utterly amazing. We have lunches in the back, so please feel free to go back at your leisure. We want to be back in here at 1 o'clock. We have, so the box lunches are back there. There's a vegetarian, there's a traditional club, and a chicken salad. And you're welcome to come back in here and eat. You may eat outside or wherever you'd like to go. Just please not into the gallery. I'm getting there. Just please not into the galleries. No food or drink in the galleries. But otherwise, you're welcome to take your box lunch and eat wherever you would like. Thank you. Back here at 1.